Hello, this is the first of 3 videos walking you through the review for today, in case you want to do it faster and not so much like long waiting and back and forth with me. Let me back up in the slides actually. What we're going to do is we're going to be making this by the end of the day. So buttons where you can mouse over them and they turn green when you hover your mouse. And then when you click on them, each button has a name that it's stored inside of itself. And when you click it, the name of the button you last clicked appears here at the bottom. So that's what we'll get to eventually, but it's in 3 parts, and this is the first video where we'll just talk about how do you do the collision detection? How do you tell if a mouse is inside a box? And then we'll give the buttons names, and we'll practice getting the right name for whichever button your mouse is hovering over. And that's all just using objects, but no array list. Then the next video, we review array lists, like how do they work, and then how can we have all of our buttons be stored into a list so that the code isn't so long. And then in part 3, we'll make the last very small change so that it'll respond to mouse clicks rather than just mouse hovering. Okay, so if you want to do this typing along with me, you should set up sort of an empty example like this. You can use the same project as last time, just clear out whatever you happen to have in draw right now and clear out whatever extra variables you have. But we're still going to be using the same rectangle class from last time, so you'll still want to be able to use that. I've named my class button example, which you are welcome to use, but you can also, like I said, just reuse whatever your example class was from last time. So let's pretend we have a rectangle here. And here's the rect command that displays it. So we're at its upper left-hand corner is at 100, 200. The width is 150 and the height is 75. So if you remember when we did this before, we had 2 coordinates that are built in, mouse X and mouse Y. And that tells you the current location of the mouse. So we want 2 if statements that check is the mouse's X coordinate larger than the left side of the box and also smaller than the right side of the box. So is the mouse horizontally in the right position to be inside? And then that's the first if statement. Then the second if statement is the mouse's Y coordinate larger than the coordinate for the top of the box and smaller than the coordinate for the bottom of the box? So if you'd like to, think for a second. If you were going to write down the coordinates here and here, go ahead and write them down. I'll give you a hint. The coordinate here is not 150. Think about the meaning of this third input. Okay, so the answer is the first input, 100, tells you the X coordinate of the upper left-hand corner, but this 150 is the width of the rectangle. So 100 plus a width of 150 gives you a right-hand coordinate of 250. Okay, with that in mind, go ahead now and look at these and see if you can say what should those 2 coordinates be. So the Y coordinate is 200 plus a height of 75 gives you the lower right-hand coordinate, the lower Y coordinate of 275. All right, so now go ahead and fill in the if statements. Here they are. So we're saying the mouse coordinate has to be bigger than or equal to 100. That's the left-hand side. And also the mouse coordinate has to be smaller than or equal to the right-hand side. And then the Y coordinate has to be larger than or equal to the top. And also, the Y coordinate has to be smaller than or equal to the bottom. So these 2 if statements test to see is the mouse inside these 4 boundaries. And if it is, then we'll load green as the fill color. And the rectangle we draw will be green. If these if statements weren't true, then the fill color is still red, which we set it to be up there. So you can go ahead and try that, and you should be able to get a nice mouse over effect where the rectangle displays red right until your mouse is on top of it. Okay, so that was just sort of a warm-up. In your actual program last time, remember, you weren't drawing a rectangle with numbers for the location and the width and the height. Instead, we had this rectangle object, and the rectangle object is saved inside a variable called R1. You created a new rectangle inside setup, and here I've hidden the inputs because I don't want you to be tempted to use numbers. Remember that you do make a rectangle by telling it what its position and so forth is, but here on afterwards, you want to actually ask the rectangle for its internal variables. So here in my display statement, I'm displaying the upper left-hand corner as rectangle 1's x-coordinate and rectangle 1's y-coordinate. And hopefully you remember the way that you access a variable inside an object is using the dot notation here, where you have the name of the variable and then a dot, and then the name of the internal variable for your object. So go ahead and decide what would you fill into the question marks here to do the same thing, but this time using variables instead of numbers. Hopefully, this is what you said. So the mouse x has to be larger than the left-hand side, and the left-hand side is rectangle 1's x. And it's got to be smaller than the right-hand side, and the right-hand side is rectangle 1x plus rectangle 1's width. So instead of being a single number, it's an expression where we're adding together the x-coordinate and the width to get the right-hand coordinate. And then similarly for y. All right, so this is a little bit ugly. So another big theme from last time was the idea that you can move a lot of code that's about a rectangle inside the rectangle class. So that way, instead of having all your rectangle code out here, you can just have a single command. For example, wouldn't it be nice if rectangles had a command called contains, where you can ask a rectangle, do you contain this coordinate? So that's just a way of asking, if I give you an x and a y coordinate, can you tell me yes or no, is that coordinate inside your boundaries? So that's what this method is supposed to do. But since it's a method that a rectangle object is running, we have to make it inside the rectangle class. So let's think about what that might look like. So here on the right is the same code I showed you a second ago. Here we're saying if rectangle 1 contains the mouse coordinates, then we'll set the fill color to be green. So when this runs, we jump over to the rectangle class, and you have to write this contains method. So based on how we're using it here, think about what should go here and what should go there. In other words, what kind of answer will contains return at the end, and what kinds of inputs does it need to do its job. So if I look at the inputs, I'm trying to give it 2 coordinates, and I believe they might be float actually. I think they're int. So you don't have to call them mouse x, mouse y here. You could call them whatever you want. But it does need 2 integers as input. And then the point of this command is it's answering a question. Does the rectangle contain these coordinates? So the answer is going to be yes or no. And the data type for that is Boolean. So we're going to return either true or false for whether our rectangle contains the point. Okay, so let's pretend now, this is still the rectangle class. Let's pretend that I just copy and pasted the old code for testing if the mouse is inside the rectangle. So there's sort of 2 things wrong with this. See if you can figure out what they are. So the first thing that's wrong with it is there's no R1 variable anymore. The R1 variable was the name of the rectangle variable over in our main program. But here, this is the rectangle class. So in this part of the code, this class is the rectangle. So we don't need to use the rectangle. We don't need to use a variable name that's a rectangle because this whole class itself is a rectangle. So you can just delete it, delete the R1s. And now when we see an x variable, it's referring to the x variables up here that are the variables of this rectangle who's trying to answer the question about itself. So then the other thing that's wrong is we don't actually want to change any fill colors here. The whole point of this command is just to answer the yes/no question, is the mouse coordinate inside the rectangle? So if the 2 if statements are true, we don't want to take any action. All we want to do is return true because we're trying to answer the question by saying yes, the coordinates were inside the rectangle. And then at the very end, we would return false as a way of saying no, the coordinates weren't inside the rectangle. Because if one of these 2 if statements is false, then it'll jump down there, and we still need to answer the question. Okay, so That didn't add any new functionality. All we did was take the code that changes the mouse color and move most of it inside the rectangle class. So here we are back in button example. I've hidden some of the code so that we can see the important stuff on the screen. I've added the lines here in yellow. So I've created a string called active button name. And that string is what we want to display here at the bottom whenever we put our mouse on top of a button. So the way we're going to do it is when you first create your button, and I hid that part, but where you first create your button, you need to give the button a name, and you set the name in the constructor, in the same place where you tell it what its location is and what its size is. And so then when we say, hey rectangle, do you contain the mouse coordinates? If the answer is yes, then we ask the rectangle to get its name. So this is a method you'll need to add inside rectangle that returns whatever the rectangle's name is, so we can save it inside this variable. And then I added this code at the bottom, which displays the text. Fill just means use a black color. Text size 32 sets the size of the text. Text align means that the text is going to be centered. And then this last command is the one that actually displays the string. So we give it the string we wanted to display, and then the coordinates where we want it to display. So what would you need to add inside rectangle in order to make this work? You'll need to add a name variable inside rectangle. You'll need to change the constructor, and you'll need to add a getName method. So here's what that might look like inside rectangle. You see the additions are there in yellow. I didn't actually highlight this one here, but I'll change it right now. And then everything should work. Come back in part 2 where we'll think about using the rectangle class, which now is acting like a button, and we'll create lots of buttons. We'll create 5 buttons all in a row. Each button will have a different name, and as you mouse over them, the different buttons' names will appear down here.